with ET Now. This is the India Development Debate, the only debate on news television that puts the spotlight on development issues. I'm Sandeep Gurumurthy. Joining me in our news center in Delhi is my colleague Supriya Srinath. And let's take it straight to the big debate tonight. It's an all-out trade war between the US and China, hours after President Donald Trump signed in steep import tariffs on China. Beijing is now hit back. The US tariffs will affect imports worth over $50 billion from China, which has imposed reciprocal tariffs on 128 products which are mostly imported from America. Not just that, Trump has warned Beijing, saying that it is payback time for China, which has been breaching intellectual property since decades. In his advantage, Uncle Sam, as now things stand, America runs, of course, a huge trade deficit with China, and the curbs could benefit US firms to start with. But experts warn that Chinese clampdown could have serious implications for the US and the rest of the world indeed.
Now, India is not directly affected for now, but a prolonged trade war could make things difficult for us in New Delhi. In fact, it is a one-sided affair for India, which exports goods and services worth more than $60 billion from the mainland. On the other hand, Indian exports to China stands at just over $10 billion. The jitters of the big standoff between the two trade giants triggered a mega sell-off across global markets. In Asia, most indices ended in the red, even as the Sensex tumbled over 400 points in a single trading session. Bonds and currency markets did face the heat as well. European indices opened with deep cuts, while US stocks took a beating in pre-market trades. The mega trade war and what it means for markets, economies around the world and polity is a big topic of discussion and debate right here on the India Development Debate this evening. And joining us on the show is a stellar panel. Rajat Nag, Distinguished Fellow of the NCAAR. We've got Ajay Sahai, DG and CEO of FIO. Nilesha, MD, Kotak AMC. Maithili Husnul, Consulting Editor here at ET Now. And Dr. Arvind Virmani, President, Forum for Strategic Initiative and President, Chintan. Thanks each one of you for being with us. And Mr. Nag, I'll begin with you. Till about last week, we were discussing and talking about, is a trade war in the making? Is it in the realm of possibility at all? That seems to have clearly changed. Is it now fair to say that this is the new normal for the global trading system and that Trump perhaps has struck an irreparable blow to the way global trade has been done all these decades?
Well, I would hope it's not the new normal, because a trade war, an all-out trade war, will be to nobody's advantage, including the US. So I'm hoping that better sense, cooler heads will prevail, and the rest of the world will react maturely. A trade war is a no-win proposition, and notwithstanding what Mr. Trump might think, nobody wins in a trade war. So I'm hoping that countries, China, Europe, India included, all will react in a mature, measured way, and hopefully we'll sort of see some clawing back of some of the trade issues which are obviously so paramount today, which could lead to a trade war.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Virmani, comment on that. Do you agree with Professor Nag? Do you share his optimism? Does a trade war still seem like an extreme event? Do you think there's any chance that US will pull back from the brink? Or do you believe, as Joseph Stiglitz says, China now can't afford to be seen as weak against a bully, so it will retaliate, and that in turn will trigger a series of other chain reactions?
So there are many issues here. Let me quickly list some of them. One is, for example, there are actually three issues. Only one of them is trade. One is asymmetry in FDI. That is, China can participate in FDI to a larger extent that it allows any other country to participate in terms of sectors and percentages in US. That is one issue. The second issue is forced transfer of technology. One has known this for a long time, but over the last year or two, tens of stories have come out from Germany, from US, etc., where foreign companies with high tech are being forced to transfer their technology for the privilege, so-called, of continuing to operate in China. And the third one, of course, is the trade issue. Now, very briefly, as far as trade is concerned, I draw a distinction between non-market economies like China and market economies. I have no doubt that tariff actions which have been taken, say, against NAFTA or EU earlier are wrong and will not benefit any of those countries. However, I differ with the conventional wisdom, which you will hear a lot about, I am sure, that this is also applies to China. China is a non-market economy. It has tens of non-transparent, non-tariff barriers, which others, democratic countries which follow rule of law are not able to apply. So there is an asymmetry. The question is the best way of dealing with it, as President Trump is doing? That I think requires further discussion. It's not clear that even if his instincts about China are correct, whether they are going about it systematically and in the right way.
No, of course, many questions can be raised if this is the way to go about it, but the reality is that they are looking to pursue this. Maitli, if I may come to you, is this just a powerful negotiating tool, using it as a stick to increase leverage in trade negotiations? Because if we actually see the reality of what's really happening, the European Union and Canada have all been exempt from trade barriers. And obviously the jibe and the narratives and now the action seems to be restricted between two partners, that's China on one hand and US on the other. Is this also a deliberate move to get leverage?
Well, President Trump has made no bones about the fact that his prime enemy, quote unquote, as he sees it, is China. So even though the initial tariffs that he introduced on steel and aluminium seem to initially hit Canada and Mexico, most of all NAFTA allies, the fact is that now he's made it clear, he's come out in the open and it's very evident that it is China all along. And as Rajat says, that this, if trade tensions escalate, this is something that leaves no winners at all. Because even though one might say that it's between the US and China, the fact is that global supply chains are so closely interlinked now that this is a war, quote unquote, that will not leave any winners at all. And when two elephants fight, it's always the grass that gets trampled on. And in the matter of global trade, India is basically essentially the grass. So we will get hurt even if we, as many have advocated, India steers clear. I'm not so sure that that is the right answer, or that we will not get hurt if we steer clear.
Indeed. Now let's analyze the India impact. Nilesh, I'm coming to you, but before that, I want to get a quick word from Ajay Sahai. Ajay, like Maitri pointed out, while this largely is a US-China dispute as of now, but do you believe it has a potential to embroil the rest of other countries as well? Or do you believe that realistically India is still such a minuscule part of global trade that it's unlikely to be significantly affected, even if this were to blow up?
First of all, I don't believe that this will translate into a trade war. In fact, the US has yet to decide the products on which US is going to increase the duty. A 15 days time limit is there. 30 days time will be available to China for consultation. And I'm sure during the consultation process, they will be able to bridge the gap. Of course, US is concerned because US trade deficit with China has increased from around $100 billion in 2001 to around $375 billion. And though even I do admit that China may be treated as a non-market economy, there are ways to deal with the non-market economy, maybe in the form of anti-dumping duty or or safeguard duty. But I don't think that the tariff increase would be something which is justifiable for a multilateral discipline under the WTO. And secondly, I don't feel that India would be much impacted. Our exposure to US in the product where the duties has been increased on the steel and aluminum is very, very less. And if the duties on China is increased across the board on 25%, I think the competitors to China may be a gainer. So in the short term, we may see that the place which is vacated by China may be occupied by the competing country, but I don't think that this kind of duty will last for a pretty long time.
Right, Mr. Sahai. Nilesh, I'm going to come to you, and I really want to understand the market reactions, and the markets have seen some sort of panic selling, obviously. What will you attribute this to? Is it just the fact that nearly 25% of BSE 500 companies are driven entirely by global factors? And do you then believe and argue that it's a concern for earnings? Will earnings be under pressure? And is that why we are seeing this panic reaction? I mean, what explains that?
So it will be futile to attribute today's market fall to expectation of tariff war. The stocks which have outperformed are defensives like IT sector, and they are as vulnerable to trade wars as the PSU banks which have fallen. Second, if we see FIIs have been net buyer, whereas the DIIs have been net sellers. If market fall was attributable to trade wars, then it is likely that FIIs should have sold and DIIs should have bought. So today's fall is more attributable to local factors than global factors. That's point number one. Point number two, there is some hope probably in the buyers who are buying in the market today that US President, when his country's trade deficit with China is about 2%, is moving heaven and earth to control that deficit. Hopefully India, whose trade deficit with China is 2.5% plus of GDP, will also take some corrective action and bring this trade deficit down. As that trade deficit starts coming down, local manufacturing units, local small and medium enterprises will have a breathing space. So the buyers are optimistic that maybe there will be some action at the India's end to control the ballooning Chinese trade deficit. But today's fall is more attributable to local factors rather than global factors.
Mm-hmm. It's an interesting point that you made on why the buyer, what the buyers are looking at, and I want Professor Rajat Nag to react on that. Is this the sort of this is sort of reaction that people are while there are people buying on that logic, people also worry that if every country starts looking at international trade from the point of view of bridging its trade deficit with a particular country, what does it really mean for global trading order? And do you see that being the biggest fallout of this action of Donald Trump, that every country, India included, is now going to look at, oh, this is my trade deficit with China, so I need to take steps to correct it, and there's logical reason to do that. And do you see every other country doing that, and what consequence could that have on the global trading order? Professor Nag.
I think that's a very important point. If it were only tariffs that President Trump was imposing, one would be worried, but one could say, well, this has happened before. I mean, many presidents, many countries have done that. But I think the greater issue here is the threat to the global trading order, the rule-based trading regime. Because, mind you, it is not just the tariffs that Mr. Trump has imposed or threatened to impose. It is actually much more sinister. He has talked about reciprocal tax, for example. Now, reciprocity is a very fundamental principle of the global trading order in the WTO, which basically says that developed countries can make concession to developing countries, and the developing countries do not have to reciprocate. That's one. The US administration has not allowed some of the very important vacancies on the Dispute Settlement Board, the DSB at WTO, be filled for the last 2 years. And if that board sort of, it's now got 4 members, if it falls even one more, it cannot function. They've got a 7-member board. So my concern is exactly what you are referring to, a breakdown of the global trading order in which everybody starts to look out for itself, and therefore it becomes a race to the bottom. And I think this is where we have to think that countries will act maturely. They will look at the fact that the global trading order, the WTO, far from perfect, but the fact is that the increase in global trade has benefited everybody, including the US and of course China, India and many others. And so we have to really work to protect the trading regime, the global trading order, the rule-based order, and not focus exclusively on tariffs. I think we'll then miss the larger point.
I'll go to Nilesh and back to you, Nilesh. Which are the sectors that are likely to face pressure? Is it just metals, auto ancillaries, engineering goods? I mean, where do you believe pressure is going to now mount upon?
It will be a very difficult question because as of today, we don't know the details. And as Maithili pointed out, we don't even know whether this is a negotiation technique or it is a real technique. From our point of view, we should be taking corrective action to ensure that our IT exports don't get impacted. And whatever shortfall is occurring in US by putting tariff on or protection on Chinese imports, can that bridge be filled by Indian exporters? If we can politically maneuver these two things, I think we will be net beneficiary of the trade war between China and US, and we should focus more on what is advantage accruing to us in terms of protecting our IT industry, in terms of filling the gap which is getting created because of duties on Chinese imports.
That's an interesting point as well. You're saying that India could be at an advantageous position. I always like an optimistic take there, Nilesh. But Dr. Virmani, and I want to talk about that as well. Is that the direction which our policymakers need to think in light of this new economic order? But before we get there, Dr. Virmani, is there fear of India-specific action as well? Because Trump has made a lot of noise about India as well, and the fact that India is among the top 10 countries with whom the US runs a deficit. We saw US move WTO last week as well on India's export subsidies. So is there fear that this could be followed up with some India-specific action? He's made noise on the Harley-Davidson case as well. Do you see that coming through?
Yeah. So, one has to be very careful as an analyst. I'm not talking as just a bystander observer. As an analyst, you have to be clear not to confuse different issues. So, there is an issue of what Trump may do with respect to WTO. When he does that, we will see. As far as we are concerned, we follow WTO rules and we want that WTO order to be maintained. That is one issue. The second issue is of FDI rules and issues related to transfer of technology under 301. That is an area where it's clearly directed against China, but there may be some collateral damage to us, and we can discuss what we can do about it. The third, which is a completely separate issue, is the specific trade war against China. I think by confounding all the issues and bringing everything into the picture, we are doing ourselves harm. So I would not advise anybody to mix all these issues together, because what he does on trade war or whatever you want to call it with China is not going to affect what his separate actions are, which may or may not happen, but those decisions will be taken separately and we will discuss and deal with those. So I think it is not in India's interest to confuse all these things, one. Number two, I don't think it's in our interest. Clearly, I agree with Nilesh that as a country, our interest should be is how can we minimize any collateral damage and take advantage of it. That is what nations do. Nations are not in the business of promoting morality and general this thing when we can't do anything about it. As a general principle, if we want to do something about the general stuff, we should collaborate with EU and others and promote free trade. We are not doing that. To bring the free trade issue into this, we have, I can discuss what exactly our openness or non-openness is, but we are not known for being terribly open, and nobody is going to take us seriously if we pontificate about free trade now. So, bottom line, yes, there is possibilities of collateral damage, but there are also possibilities of taking advantage of it. And as a nation, as far as the country is concerned, it should be looking to maximize the advantage and minimize the dangers. Free trade, in my view, is a separate issue. Why don't we talk about joining TPP 11 if we are so interested in free trade? Why don't we have a EU-India agreement on free trade if we are so interested, etc., etc.? Right. I don't think we should mix those two issues.
Dr. Virmani, you make an interesting point that we need to minimize the collateral damage and leverage the situation to our best advantage. Maithili, coming to you, if there were to be a full-blown trade war, do you believe this is a lose-lose situation, or is there something in it for India, like Nilesh has said? Could India stand to gain at all? And could it emerge stronger?
Well, I don't see too many advantages for India. I don't see too many advantages for India at all, because in the matter of global trade, we really are a minnow. But I think there could be huge collateral damage, directly as well as indirectly. Directly, the fact is that the US's angst against China is essentially about its intellectual property regime. And that is where they feel that China doesn't have a very strong IPR regime. And this is precisely the same area, particularly in the context of pharma, where India has already been placed on the special watch list under its special 301 arrangement that the US has under its trade pact. So we're already on the priority watch list, and by April of this year we'll get the final report, the latest report under the US Special 301. So pharma is one area where India insists that its Patent Act, and especially Article 3D, Section 3D of the Act, is entirely TRIPS compliant, but the US has never accepted that. So pharma is one sector which could be seriously in trouble. And the indirect damage would be in terms of what it does to global recovery. This wonderful synchronized global recovery that we've all been banking on, that could be seriously jeopardized. So I think India will suffer both directly as well as indirectly, and there's very little that we can do except to try and minimize the damage to us. There's very little advantage that we can hope for. In the global trade arena, we really are a very small voice, and unfortunately the multilateral trade negotiations under WTO are virtually at a standstill, despite the completion of the mini-ministerial in Delhi, where we tried to get it going once again. The fact is, as long as US does not play ball, there's very little that the rest of the world can do.
Professor, now come in on that, because we've heard, we're hearing some potentially contrarian views on the show this evening on what India should do. And do you believe that fundamentally the WTO as it stands is at risk? It is at a standstill. We haven't made progress since the Doha round. It's almost more than a decade now. Even the mini-ministerial, I mean, it was good from a symbolism point of view, but very little actually transpired out of it. And in light of these nationalist tendencies that we're seeing across countries, and like Nilesh pointed out, the electorate might make the people who vote, are electing nationalist leaders, and they might make way or put pressure on politicians to look at more nationalist policies, even when it comes to trade. And there is a case for it as well. Do you agree?
I think Dr. Virmani has put it very well. It is a very complex issue. We should not play the morality game here. But at the same time, we have to recognize that we are all globally interconnected. Yes, India should stay safe, as Dr. Raghuram Rajan said today, but India can't stay away because we are part of the global trading system. I believe that India should, again, as Dr. Virmani said, play the rules-based game. We should emphasize that the rules be followed, not that we follow it always ourselves. WTO is far from perfect, but it's only WTO that we have got, and we've got to see that it works as best as it can. And I think the global recovery, which I think Maithili has pointed out very rightly, can be jeopardized. So I am concerned that all of this trade war and the other issues which goes with it can jeopardize India's recovery, can jeopardize the global recovery. So I don't think India can sort of just hunker down and somehow wish it away. But at the same time, there is absolutely no reason for India to punch above its weight. As other speakers have said, India is a relatively small player, an important player, but relatively small player compared to China and the US. And we've got to be strategic, and strategic means we shouldn't sort of raise our heads unduly. But I think it is wishful thinking that we can find some sort of, ways to gain out of it, maybe small gains here and there, but nobody is going to win in this. And I think it's in our interest that we contribute to the global dialogue on maturity and handling this maturely.
Fair point indeed. India doesn't need to punch above its weight, but and you rightly pointed out what Raghuram Rajan said earlier today, that we must wait and watch, because if we go into any rushed action which is joining a bloc, this could dent our own economic recovery. But Ajay Sai, as someone who's a part of the exporting community, understands the implications, what should be India's response? Should it be a passive spectator, let the global situation play out and then decide its future course of action, or should we actually look at aligning ourselves with some global bloc, one trading bloc or the other?
No, in fact, we should always keep in mind that US is our largest trading partner. Roughly 12% of India's exports of goods and services are to the US, and therefore we should not be openly taking head-on with the US. Of course, if there is a WTO movement against the US, we should definitely join the forces, because it's the multilateral system which will always help us. Secondly, I feel that even US has to look into how the trade deficit with India has decreased in last 2 to 3 years. I was looking at the data of the merchandise trade deficit. It has come down from around $25 billion to around $22 billion. And since a lot of imports of aircrafts are happening, we are importing defense equipment from them. In last year only, we have imported crude and petroleum worth around $5 billion. So I personally feel that this issue to a large extent would be resolved. Thirdly, people have already told that we also have a huge trade deficit with China, but then we need to be constructively engaged with China to increase our export to bridge the trade deficit. And if in the process there are issue of the market access, definitely we should enter into dialogue with China. In fact, Commerce Minister of China is coming to India, and I think these issues will be taken up with China. But definitely the sanctity of WTO needs to be maintained, but our business interest should always be back of mind whenever we are taking any move against US.
Interesting point. Nilesh, come in on that, and I want you to sort of, elaborate a bit more on the point that you made, and I know you sort of passionately believe in this. And, when India takes steps to protect domestic manufacturing, there's this whole cry and furor on how India is turning protectionist, and, like we did in the budget this year to aid certain segments of the manufacturing and to aid the Make in India process. You've made a case about how India is one of the rare countries where, the largest private bank, largest NBFC, the largest consumer goods company, telecom company, are all foreign owned. So in this sort of climate, is there going to be more clamor for countries to turn more protectionist? And is that the way India needs to go as well? So if other countries are erecting these trade barriers, so should India look at it? I mean, Anil Agarwal, for example, says, or Sajjan Jindal says, why don't we have higher tariffs on steel and aluminum that is manufactured in India? Is that the direction we need to look at?
There is no right answer over here. As research has proven time and again, free trade is always beneficial for everyone. It creates win-win situation. But then there are times when you have to take tactical move. For example, we created minimum import price on steel, and that has ensured that there is interest in all those steel NPAs, which otherwise would have created a lot of damage to India's banking system. That tactical move of creating protection on steel has ensured that steel NPAs have come down dramatically, and there is a competition to get steel assets which otherwise would not have been possible. Similarly, the fact remains that we have $60 billion trade deficit with China, and there are many things which we are importing and which is necessary because one, it reduces our cost in terms of consumption. Maybe we are reprocessing those items and exporting and earning revenue. But there are certain unavoidable items also. Clearly, soft toys, some of the idols which we have to import, the Kanchivaram saris which are made in China. But clearly, those are the things which we can tactically stop. And, we have to be selfish to ourselves. We can use pollution, we can use child labor, we can use safety, we can use environmental topics. We need to use all those resources so that we remain in the line of law and yet reduce imports from China. Maybe it's worth even talking to them about increasing their import from us and ensuring that the trade deficit remains in a comfortable range. Our electronic imports primarily from China will one day exceed oil imports. Now we can't afford that. We need to figure out how we can minimize those imports in a tactical manner. But strategically, do we need to provide protection to domestic industry forever? Answer is no. They must use this tactical advantage to become competitive in the global arena. So it's a very complex subject which will require deft handling. And we have to take what is a practical approach, give tactical protection, at the same time make our industry competitive to face global challenges.
All right, Dr. Arvind Virmani, you kind of irked to the debate in the direction that we can't afford to pontificate because we haven't been the biggest believers in free trade, truth be told. But the reality also is that Indian industry has been at the receiving end of cheap Chinese imports. I mean, when Nilesh talks about Kanjivaram saris being made in China, and when he talks about how electronic items from China could perhaps exceed oil imports, it's a red flag. It's an alarm bell that should be ringing out aloud. Do you believe it's time that New Delhi gives up all its apprehensions and listens to the demands of Indian industry and, truth be told, if that means being protectionist, so be it. Can we be at the receiving end of these cheap Chinese imports, and for how long?
I have several points, and by the way, I've been involved in India-China trade discussions. So let me make them very quickly. One, let us not again, I repeat, don't confuse technology issues under 301 with trade. On trade, we are right now discussing things which happened in the last week or a few days, which is tariffs on trade. Okay, that's the issue, one issue. We can discuss the other one also, but I just don't understand why we keep mixing them, because it's not in our favor to do that. Second, when we say we are small in trade, please don't forget, we are not part of the global supply chains. We have been complaining, we have been telling the government, I have, others have, that we should become part of the supply chains by reducing tariffs, not increasing them, and by promoting ease of importing and exporting. That's number 2 point. Number 3, I have myself been engaged in discussions on a free trade agreement with China. It's long ago, 10 years ago, but since then I have followed it. They don't listen. They have non-tariff barriers which we have pointed again and again and again from the government, much after I left this whole issue, and they have not listened. That doesn't mean we should not keep trying, but let us not be under illusions. Let us not be under illusions, okay? That somehow if we just talk to them, they are going to reverse this. They have non-tariff barriers. They have non-transparent non-tariff barriers, not against just India, but everybody, including US, Europe, all the things. The 4th point, there is a fundamental distinction in my way of looking at economics of trade, between market economies, where I believe that reduction of tariffs is good for all, good for India, good for US, good for everybody, and therefore that is not the way to go. On the other hand, I make a distinction between non-market economies, and China is the biggest exemplar probably ever, because the USSR was a closed economy. There was no trade, even at the height of its communism. There was no trade. They didn't come out and take advantage as a non-market economy of the market economies. China was facilitated. So, I mean, we are not putting blame game here, but clearly the US and EU themselves facilitated and in a sense facilitated this unfair trade. So there is unfair trade. There is no question about it. So I do not disagree with Nilesh that perhaps something should be done. And finally, we imposed certain tariffs earlier. How many people, everybody criticized it. I did not, just in the budget, because I said again that one must make a distinction. Please do not put higher tariffs on market economies. Look for products where China has a monopoly. Many products is completely monopolized. It's not just competition. I don't agree with this free trade argument that they monopolize 90% of the market for toys just because they are competitive. No, it was a deliberate non-market effort. So my point is only that if you are going to act against the trade deficit, sorry, one more point, a point I have also made on your show before, that this asymmetry of exports to imports like we have, like the US has, means that you are more likely to win in such a situation. The US, I don't want to get into a trade war between India and China, because the issue is right now China and US, but I don't agree with those people who say that US and China will lose equally. No, China will lose more, certainly US will lose. So again, so finally, what should India do? I think at this point in time, we don't need to get into it. We should not raise this issue of asymmetric China publicly. We don't want to enter the public debate at this point. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do things at all. We have done them, and the point is to refine them, not kind of exaggerate and make a big deal of it at this point in time.
Okay, we need to take a more nuanced position and not sort of really go harping on the trade deficit. That's a different perspective there coming in from Dr. Virmani. The closing comments, really, Maithili, to you first. 2018 is expected to be the strongest year for the global economy since 2011. Does this whole trade war, change the entire outlook? How worried are you of what it could do to global growth?
Well, yes, it is a potential threat, and one really doesn't know how far this will go, because at the moment we still haven't seen the full list and what kind of retaliatory action China can take. Because remember, China is the largest holder of US Treasury bills. So if China really wants to have a standoff with the US, it could dump those Treasury bills, and that could have serious repercussions on the US economy, because interest rates in the US will rise, and rise very dramatically. So this is a war, quote unquote, if it happens, which will leave no winners at all. And to the extent that India will get affected by whatever happens to the global economy, India would also get affected. So it is in our interest to try and push the multilateral forum as much as possible, even as we try to stay away from the direct fight between US and China. But certainly this is not in anybody's interest.
Fair point. Mr. Nag, Dr. Nag, if I may come to you. Okay, Ajay Sahai, before I go to Dr. Naga, Ajay Sahai, very quickly, India itself is betting on a 15% growth in exports, and our export growth is obviously very closely linked to the global recovery. It will be a huge engine for our own growth. Given the new realities and given this narrative and given the actions that the trading blocs are taking, does this dampen that outlook, the 15% growth outlook? Do you believe we'll have to temper that expectation?
No, definitely, because this kind of uncertainty is going to affect the growth of the global trade, and if the global trade slows down, it will be really difficult for India to sustain the growth of around 15%. But I think it's too early to come to these conclusions. What I am really worried about is that these kinds of action will lead to increasing protectionism in different parts of the globe, and that is something where Indian export may suffer. But still, let us vote that the negotiation between the two countries turn out to be positive and they are able to bridge the gap to the extent possible.
Fair point. Nilesh, coming to you, and then we'll go to Professor Nag for a last word. India, Nilesh, trade war, no trade war, India is the only emerging market that is projected to grow at greater than 7%, and yet Nifty is down over 5% this year, when the MSCI Emerging Markets Index is up 3.7%. So how does this really change the outlook for our markets? Because there are a lot of investors out there who are now worried, who are now anxious, or wondering what's going to happen. What does all of this mean, as it is for a market that is performing poorly compared to its emerging market peers, largely kind of valuation concerns, I'm guessing.
So to the foreigners, we can say that, and this was a WhatsApp forward which I am referring. In China, you have dictator. In Russia, you have dictator. In Brazil, you have corruption. And in South Africa, you have instability. Please take your choice correctly. In India, we have democracy. That's more in lighter vein. On a serious note, I think we have to realize that the pitch has changed. 2017 was Indian cricket pitch on which any investor could have scored runs. 2018 is more like a South African pitch. You have to apply yourself like Virat Kohli to score runs. Otherwise, it will be difficult to bet. But if you take a longer term view, despite all the volatilities which will be there in 2018, it will give you an opportunity to buy stocks with a 2-year, 3-year, 5-year horizon. So use the volatility to enter yourself into Indian equity market, looking at the long-term potential.
All right. Rajat Nag, final question to you, sir. What is the best and what is the worst case scenario amidst this global trade war or global trade skirmishes or whatever else you may call it as far as India is concerned?
Well, let me just broaden a bit, not just as far as India is concerned. I remember the president of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, recently said, "We can also do stupid." I'm just hoping that the rest of the world does not do stupid, and that of course includes India. And I think if we in India give any concession to protectionist tendencies, for people to say some of the countries are going protectionist, so should we, I think that would be stupid. And I think I would hope very much that we don't. I am actually very concerned that what is looking like tariff impositions, beginning of a trade war, could spin out of control if countries start doing stupid things in terms of retaliation, and it's a race to the bottom. And therefore, what I'm hoping very much that we will still stick with rule-based trading regime, rule-based global trading order, which has not been perfect, is not perfect, but has served everybody well, including India. But India should also be very strategic and recognize that it, at this juncture, really plays a better serves its interests better by keeping a low key, low profile, and just wait and watch, I think would be the right way to go.
Oh, indeed. Couldn't agree more with you. We will not do no stupid, but who knows, with Donald Trump at the helm of affairs, what reactions his moves might trigger is something that no one can really guess at this point in time. But thank you all, this wonderful panel, Rajat Nag, Maithili Busturmat, Nilesh Shah, Arvind Virmani and Ajay Sahai for joining in with that perspective. This is an important and a delicate moment as far as the global economic order is concerned, because the prospect of a trade war is scary for the entire global economy. It's very scary for India as well. Hopefully we'll avert one, hopefully we'll stay away from one, and hopefully we'll improve our own competitiveness so that even if there were to be one, we can fight along.
Completely out of time on this edition of the India Development Debate. Thanks very much for being with us. Keep it with ET Now.